Welcome to the Global Philosophy of Religion project at the University of Birmingham, run by Professor Yujin Nagasawa. We at Closer to Truth are pleased to participate. Thank you for joining us. In our panels, we bring together philosophers and scholars from different traditions to explore common topics, inviting diverse ways of thinking while not avoiding contradictions, whether they're real or apparent. In this panel on traits of God and other deities, we want to cover many probative questions. So we're going to request our panelists to give brief or very brief responses, which is not what they would normally be doing in their papers and classes. So this can allow some cross-traditional explorations. The panel is live, so attendees, please send in your questions. We'll get to a few at the end. So I want to begin by asking each panelist to introduce themselves in 1 or 2 sentences, then another 2 or 3 sentences on their primary scholarly interests related to their tradition. So I want to begin alphabetically by last names, beginning with Islam, Imran, Aijaz.
Thank you, Robert. So hi, everyone. My name is Imran Aijaz. I am an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan in Dearborn, in the United States, though currently I'm visiting family and friends in Auckland, New Zealand. So quite far away from where I usually am, but it's fun down here. My research area is philosophy of religion, Islamic philosophy, medieval Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophy. And some of the problems I'm interested in exploring are problems of faith and reason and religious pluralism.
Judaism, Joshua Golding.
Hi, so I'm Joshua Golding, and I am a professor of philosophy at Bellarmine University, which is in Louisville, Kentucky. Bellarmine is a college which was rooted in the Catholic tradition, but it's a very open and pluralistic type of place. I've been teaching at Bellarmine for 30 years. My interests are philosophy of religion and also Jewish philosophy. Like Imran, I'm very interested in questions having to do with faith and reason. Some of my scholarship involves particularly pragmatic justification of religious faith, most famously of the sort in Pascal's Wager. I've written a bit on Pascal's Wager. I'm also interested in the Jewish spiritual path, other spiritual paths as well, and trying to understand from a rational point of view, what is the spiritual path and how does one go about relating to God in a spiritual manner?
Hinduism, Swami Medhananda.
Thank you, Robert. My name is, Swami Medhananda. I'm a monk of the Ramakrishna order and a senior research fellow in philosophy at the Ramakrishna Institute of Moral and Spiritual Education in Mysore, India, South India. My research interests are cross-cultural philosophy of religion, Vedantic philosophical traditions, and especially the philosophies of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo. And Indian scriptural hermeneutics. And I just wanted to mention briefly that because Hinduism is a vast religion, in today's panel, I'm most likely going to be answering the questions from the standpoint of my own tradition, which is the tradition of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, 19th century Vedantic saints, basically.
So Swami, let me just ask you, how representative is that of Hinduism in general? How could we relate the two?
I see the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition as a kind of revival and broadening of traditional Vedanta, which is kind of mainstream within Hinduism.
Okay, thank you. Christianity, Ryan Mullins.
So I'm Ryan Mullins. I'm currently a senior research fellow at the Collegium for Advanced Studies at the University of Helsinki. So my primary research interests are on rival models of God and the God-world relationship. Thus far, most of my research is focused on God's relationship to time and then God's emotional life. But part of my overall project is to identify different models of God and then try to figure out how to test which model of God has the best fit with Christianity.
We look forward to those questions. We have a question on God and time for Closer to Truth, the relationship between God and time. Even if you don't believe in God and you're not sure about time, but that interrelationship is very probative of many philosophical issues. So we're going to get to that. Okay, time to begin for our questions. And our first question is, I'm going to ask you for very short answers, then we're going to see how they articulate. And the question is, in your tradition, which stated, so we know, what is the divine essence? So because we have three Abrahamic religions with us, we're going to give privilege of first answer to the non-Abrahamic religion. So Swami, what is the divine essence?
So according to most traditions within Hinduism, and especially my tradition, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, the divine essence is Sat Chit Ananda in Sanskrit, which means existence, consciousness, bliss. And in our tradition, that Sat Chit Ananda has two fundamental aspects that are accessible to us. So in one aspect, it's the attributeless, impersonal, non-dual absolute, or otherwise called pure consciousness, or Brahman. And in another aspect, it's the personal God who creates, preserves, and destroys the universe and is responsive to prayer.
Okay, for the Abrahamic religions, we'll do it chronologically. So Josh, that means you go first.
Yes, okay, thank you, Robert. Actually, there's already a lot of similarity here between what I'm about to say and what Swami just said, I think. From the Jewish point of view, there's the essence of God, which is what you asked about. The essence of God is an infinite, indescribable, ineffable being of some sort. Perhaps some would identify perhaps the essence of God as being itself. Indefinable, pretty much. There's a lot of negative theology in Judaism. You can't really describe the essence itself. However, that essence also manifests itself in the form of, or in a way similar to, the way a person would act. So we would ascribe intelligence and agency or will, personhood to God. God is also conceived of as benevolent, omnipotent, a just God. And God has a plan for the universe, which he has created, which is ultimately to lead to some very positive, good end for the universe and for individuals in the universe.
Ryan, Christianity?
So I take the concept of God to be that of a perfect being who's the ultimate foundation of reality. So the divine essence is just a set of great-making properties or attributes that make God the greatest possible being. So attributes like necessary existence, eternality, maximal power, goodness, knowledge, perfect rationality, those sort of things. But what Christianity would add is that the divine essence is shared by three divine persons who all have that essence.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that, because that'll probably bring up some differences among the traditions that we have. We're starting to be too similar, and I was getting aggravated. So thank you very much for the Trinity, Ryan. Imran, Islam.
Great, thanks, Robert. So again, like what people have said before, there's going to be a lot in common with, I think, not certainly with what Joshua said, but also what Swami said on transcendence and notions of ineffability in Islam. I think that the most emphasized feature of the divine essence in Islam and all the kind of different denominations and the kind of interpretations is the oneness and the uniqueness of the divine, of God, what in Arabic is called tawheed. So the uniqueness and the oneness of God. Nothing other than God possesses the divine essence. And when I talk about other than, I'm talking about all of God's creation. So all of God's creation, which is distinct from him, does not have the divine essence. It is only God who has the divine essence, in virtue of which he is one and unique.
So if we're hearing a great deal of similarity in terms of this divine essence, I'm trying to tease apart some of the different things that I've just heard. So Josh, you've talked about a dual doctrine within historic Judaism of Atzmut and Sephirot, which aims, you said, to preserve the notion that while God's essence is perfectly one, which is the sort of the standard, it's also true that this essence manifests itself in different ways. So how do those two work together in Jewish tradition?
Well, that's a good question, and I think that different thinkers would answer that in a different way. But for me, the way I've tried to articulate that in some of my written work is that we can conceive of God's essence as being itself. Okay, so there, like Imran said, being itself, there's nothing other than being itself, which is being itself. It's a very radically unique kind of thing. It's perfectly one, basically indescribable, except for a few things you might be able to say about it. But that being itself manifests itself in certain ways. There are certain, we could use the term maybe structural principles. I like to think of the Jewish doctrine of Sefirot as not as entities in and of themselves, although some Jewish thinkers would do that. The Sefirot are not entities. They are rather ways in which being itself manifests itself. So there's lots of different ways in which being is manifest. Being is manifest in the physical world. Being is manifest in trees, creatures, fish, human beings. And speaking of human beings, the human being manifests God in a certain very unique and special way when compared to other creatures. So there's being itself, and then there's the ways in which being is manifest. That is what I take the Sefirot to be.
Look, I want to get into a very simple question on the divine essence, and that is the divine essence total unity, or are there different aspects of it that sort of become like parts? Because this is doctrine, which we're not going to get into in Christian philosophy, of divine simplicity, in which everything is sort of all the same and you can't differentiate within God. So I want to ask very quickly each of our panelists from their traditions, what is the concept of unity within the divine essence versus sufficiently different parts of the divine essence, which become things that come together to compose what God is. So let's start, Swami.
Yeah, I would say that in our tradition, I wouldn't use the language of parts, I would use the language of aspects. So in one aspect, God is personal. In another aspect, it's impersonal. The language of parts becomes mereological, and I'm not sure it makes sense within a Hindu tradition to talk about a God with parts.
Yeah. Okay. Ryan, traditionally the doctrine of divine simplicity, how is that holding up?
Well, a lot of Christians today think it's the worst thing to ever be introduced into the Christian tradition. And I'm quite happy to affirm that as well, that it's the worst thing to be introduced into the Christian tradition, because I can't see how it's possibly consistent with God acting in the world, or being triune, or having knowledge of what's going on in the world, or having free will. So yeah, I think I think what the Christian needs to say instead is God has properties or distinct attributes. I don't see why we should call them parts, though.
Imran, obviously in Islam, you've said that unity is so important. So how does that affect our deep understanding of the divine essence?
Right. So great question. I think, we're getting some great comments here. I think it depends, Robert, on which Islamic thinker you ask, actually. One of the things people don't really pay attention to is how in Islam, you're not looking at a monolithic religion, but you have different schools and ideas and philosophies. So I'll just be very brief here and say that actually, so I will disagree with Ryan, politely, of course. The one thing that I find quite attractive is the doctrine of divine simplicity. It just could be because of our kind of differing religious traditions. It's really articulated nicely by so many medieval thinkers. One that I'll just throw out here, I just mention him by name, is the great medieval Islamic thinker Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, who effectively refers to God as a necessary being. And the brief argument here, and I won't unpack it in detail, but roughly is this: if God is a necessary being, God must be self-sufficient. God must contain within himself the reason for his existence. Everything else is contingent and is actualized by an external cause. If we think that God actually is composed of parts, if there's composition in the divine, then the divine exists through the parts, which is, the argument goes, a violation of divine aseity, or God's independence. So I find the doctrine attractive, but obviously there's much more that we can say.
Okay, let's go on to the traits of God, the specific traits or attributes that God or deities possess. And so the way I want to frame this is, how do the traits or attributes in your tradition articulate with those of the classical Abrahamic God of perfect being theology? And obviously those in the Abrahamic tradition will expound on this view. And again, as we've heard, all the omnis, omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresent, omnibenevolence, and all three, various other things. So Imran, I want to start with you, because in developing this perfect being theology, Christian philosophy relied to some extent on Islamic philosophy from the Middle Ages. So Imran, from your point of view, I know Islam has these 99 names of God. So how do those 99 names articulate with these, half a dozen or so omnis?
Right. So great question, Robert. So the 99 names of God will include God's oneness, his uniqueness, for sure. What you will also find on the list of the 99 names that are derived from the Quran, so the Islamic holy text, and the Hadith, right? So reports of sayings and actions attributed to the Prophet of Islam, to the Prophet Muhammad. You will also see God's beneficence, God's mercy, God's holiness, and so on and so forth. On the list, we do have three that are, I think, the standard kind of three omni properties you see in discussions of God. So God is referred to as Al-Jabbar, which some people say is omnipotence. God is omnipotent. Al-Alim, he's omniscient, we're told, and he's beneficent. He's Al-Rahman. Okay. Now, I've pointed out that actually there is a bit of a question here as to whether we're reading in omni-God theism into the text or we're deriving it from the text. So, are we really talking about God being omnipotent, for example, when we read in the Islamic text in the Quran that he's Al-Jabbar, or do we mean something like God is supremely powerful? So I do think, Robert, there's a very important question here as to whether omni-God theism is something that is simply kind of derived from the Islamic text, in my view.
In Christian philosophy, Ryan, how important is a perfect being theology, which you've articulated to begin?
It's a very standard way of trying to develop the doctrine of God. So typically you have people looking at scripture and looking at perfect being theology and trying to work out their doctrine of God accordingly. You get some conflicts though with different intuitions. So here would be an example of this. So scripture in the Old and New Testament, it affirms that God has empathy. In the Christian tradition, typically they'll say God does not literally have empathy, God does not literally have compassion, until you get to the 1800s, and then people are going to say, how could God be perfect in love and perfectly good if he doesn't have empathy? So you have a big conflict here. And I want to side with the more modern thinkers who want to say, well, yeah, a perfectly loving God, a perfectly all-knowing God, that's going to require empathy. And here be why. So if I want to know all there is to know about you, I might know all the propositional facts about you, but there's more to know about you. If I really want to know what it's like to be you, then I would need to know your affective states, your emotions, your experiential states. And that's what empathy is. It's coming to know what it's like to be you. It's coming to know your experiential and affective states. So empathy, if God's got if he really is all knowing, then empathy seems like a natural extension of that, because it's going to give God all the facts about who you are, and then also the facts about what it's like to be you. So I think it does fit with perfect being theology, at least the method of perfect being theology, if not everybody's intuitions, though. What about what a perfect being would be like?
And so some would say that's narrowing the range of perfect being theology, because you're allowing God to have be affected, be changed, and so that's a very different way of thinking. Who some believe that in order to create that which there is none greater, the classic definition, Anselm definition of perfect being theology, that you're watering that down?
Well, so what I'm not doing is watering it down, and here's why. So whenever you're doing perfect being theology, everybody's going to bring their own intuitions to the table. And so there's other philosophical assumptions that kind of pump your intuitions in certain ways. One philosophical assumption that had a very big influence in the Christian tradition was that all change is for the better or worse. If you reject that assumption, then it's not going to really change. It's not going to really affect whether or not you think God's perfect. It's just going to affect which things you think are going to be perfections. So being completely unchanging, well, if you get rid of that philosophical assumption, then you're not going to have a lot of reason to think that God's going to be unchanging.
Josh, in Judaism, I get the feeling that the God of Judaism is exactly the opposite of the philosopher's God of perfect being theology, because the God of Judaism kind of interacts with human beings rather freely, almost equally. God can be challenged, God could be criticized, and God maybe doesn't mind that. Do I got that right?
Yeah, I think you do have that right, especially on a plain reading of the scripture. That certainly seems to be the case. I think Imran raised a good point earlier about you have these scriptural texts that go back a long way in time, and then you have philosophers such as people like Moses Maimonides in the Middle Ages, who was certainly very much influenced by people like Plato and especially Aristotle. And then trying to sort of harmonize the plain reading of the text with what they thought, or what Maimonides thought, or what some people still to this very day think to be true about what would the best possible being be like. And obviously there's some differences of opinion even in this room about what the best possible being would be like. But I think that Judaism allows for different schools of thought. Judaism allows for different ways of articulating who or what exactly God is. And Maimonides, argued based on the Talmud that the literal meaning of the text is not always to be taken as the ultimate truth, that the text speaks after the language of man, so to speak. The text is written in such a way that a child or a young person can begin to appreciate who or what God is, even though deep down, so to speak, at a very sophisticated level, what the text says on the surface is not actually the truth about God. For example, often the text seems to imply that God is kind of surprised by events, or he gets upset, he gets angry. He says, with the flood, the story of the flood, there's God, it says that God regretted having created the world. Why did I do this? Oh, then maybe I'll change my mind because there's this one guy, Noah, who's a good guy, so I'll save the world, right? So, I mean, you can read that at a very simple level, and God is, surprised. He doesn't see the future. But I think that, maybe part of it is that as we grow, as we mature, we come to, a more sophisticated understanding of who exactly God is. And putting together our sophisticated understanding of what a perfect being would be like with the scriptures is not such a simple matter.
Okay, let's reach beyond the Abrahamic tradition. Swami, in your tradition of Hinduism, how do God's traits articulate with those that we've heard of the Abrahamic God?
Yeah, so there are theistic traditions of Hinduism, which I think fully embrace the personal God with omni attributes. And then there's a really very different tradition within Hinduism called Advaita Vedanta, which does not accept the ultimate reality of the personal God at all. So they claim that the ultimate reality is nirguna. That's a Sanskrit word which literally means without attributes. And so they conceive this ultimate reality as non-dual pure consciousness. And in the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, we conceive God as the impersonal, personal, infinite reality. So in its personal aspect, it's the personal God with all the traditional omni attributes of perfect being theology. But there's also this non-dual pure conscious aspect, which both aspects, by the way, it's very important in Hinduism that God can be realized, experienced directly in mystical experience. And so Ramakrishna, for instance, claimed to have realized God in both aspects, both the impersonal and personal aspects.
Okay, so let's now move on to the specific question in your tradition. Is God or other deities, are they persons, a personal being with a personhood traits like awareness, intent, will, emotions, etc.? So Swami, let's continue because you've articulated this. You have different schools in Hinduism with obviously very rich philosophical ideas. How do they articulate together? Are they just two different ideas? They just happen to be lumped under Hinduism? Or is there a way that you can harmonize those two so that you can have this sort of cosmic consciousness, if you will, with God, personal traits? Those seem so radically different conceptually that one would almost want to use a different term for those religious traditions.
Yeah, I mean, Sri Ramakrishna, he uses He was like Christ in some ways in using homely analogies to explain these kinds of ideas. So one of the analogies he used was he likened Satchidananda, the ultimate reality, to an infinite ocean. And he said that in certain places, the ocean forms into different forms of ice. And he likens those different ice formations to different forms of the personal God. So in Hinduism, I think most people know that there are different kinds of deities, but they're all just different manifestations of one and the same God. And then he says, with the dawning of the sun of knowledge, those ice forms melt and go back. And so then you just see the ocean. But then he says there are some places where the ice doesn't melt at all, and it turns into quartz. So for devotional traditions, the personal God is kind of the absolute. So the analogy, I take it to mean that the substratum of God is the impersonal, but that the personal aspects of God are also real. It's not that they're any less real or any less or somehow inferior, but that they emerge from the impersonal.
So does the doctrine of reincarnation, which of course is important within, I think, most, if not all Hindu traditions, does that help inform where the articulation between the amorphous consciousness, pardon that word, and the personal God?
I don't think reincarnation does. Actually, one thing I should mention is what's really important in the tradition of Advaita Vedanta within Hinduism is that we, in our deepest essence, are that impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness. We, in our deepest nature, are that, and we can realize that if we do the requisite spiritual practices. Yeah, so I think that's right. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is about incarnations. Most Hindus accept that there are multiple incarnations of God. So most Hindus will accept Christ as an avatara, as an incarnation, but they'll also accept Buddha as an avatara and Rama and Krishna and others as avatars as well. So God can actually manifest as human beings.
Ryan, in Christianity, you have written on God and emotions. So give me a short comparison between the impassible God of classical theism and the passible God who can be affected by not only emotions, but all kinds of externalities. How does that work?
Yeah, so both of these views affirm that God has emotions. They disagree over a few other things, such as like which emotions God can have. So if you say God's impassible, you're going to say God cannot suffer, God cannot be moved, influenced, or in any way by anything outside of himself. And then finally, you're going to say God can have any emotion that's perfectly rational, perfectly good, and then that's consistent with his perfect happiness, because they're going to say God is in a state of pure, undisturbed bliss. Whereas if you're going to say, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so God is not diminished by emotions. It's just an articulation of the kinds of emotions. You know, if I were in a state of perfect bliss all the time, I'm not sure that would be perfect.
Well, the idea behind it, I guess, to help them out a little bit, would be to say, if you are in the right relationship with the greatest good, you're going to be perfectly happy. Well, God is the greatest good, so, and he's in the best relationship with himself, so he's going to be perfectly happy. That's kind of the idea.
Yeah. Is there a danger of anthropomorphizing God?
It's hard to figure out how to make those objections stick, because if anybody tries to say, hey, you're anthropomorphizing, it's hard to figure out where that stops. Because it seems like everybody's going to be anthropomorphizing to some extent, because we're looking at perfections we find in ourselves and then predicating them of God. Yeah.
Josh, in Judaism, it seems like a tautology to say God is a person, because everything we hear about God seems just like, you know, my Uncle Morris.
Well, you have a great uncle then. I think that, you know, I was just going to say, might be good to share a little bit, you know, Moses Maimonides, I mentioned him before. In his work, The Guide to the Perplexed, he takes on a lot of these types of questions that we're dealing with here. And I think one of the fundamental points that Maimonides makes, and I'm not saying he's the only one who does this by any means, but famously in the Jewish tradition, Moses Maimonides does this. We have to make a distinction between God's essence and God's actions, okay? God's essence is infinite, and Maimonides says only, you know, describable negatively what it's not. I'm not sure he really sticks to that. God is a being of some sort. God is either being itself or pure being or infinite being. but that's the essence of God. That's what's unchanging. That's what's perfect. That's what doesn't really experience emotions. That's completely perfect in and of itself, aseity. I think Imran used that term before, necessary being, eternal, everlasting, independent. That is the essence of God. Now, by the same token, God acts, okay? Maimonides says that this single perfect unitary being has many, 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 many actions, okay? God does a lot of things every day, infinite numbers of things, okay? So when we talk about God experiencing or having compassion or benevolence or getting angry or feeling sorry for somebody or having empathy, I guess it's unlike what Ryan would say from his point of view about God. According to Maimonides, the perfect essence doesn't really experience those things. It's all about, it's these epithets that we use to describe God, that the Bible uses to describe God, they're very important. Compassion, justice, all those things, those are ways of describing God's actions, okay? And to me, that works. It doesn't bother me to learn that in his perfect essence, he doesn't really experience a bad day. It's a way of talking about how God interacts with the world. I have no problem. I mean, to me, that is a satisfactory way of looking at the situation.
I'm glad we teased apart some nice differences. So I want to go to Islam, Imran. And Islamic philosophers tell me that when I ask some questions that God is so far beyond any category, that God's being is beyond being. So if that is the case, how does God have personhood traits, or is it so far, the concept of person is so far outside the realm of God that we can't even discuss personhood as a category?
So I think, again, Robert, it depends on which Islamic philosopher you ask. There are Islamic philosophers who I think would agree with basically everything Joshua said, because there are Islamic philosophers who agree with Maimonides, more or less. Maimonides seems to have quite a radical position where, as Joshua says, from my memory in reading The Guide for the Perplexed, we can describe God by talking about his actions, because I believe, Joshua, correct me if I'm wrong, when we talk about the actions, they're not directly saying anything about the essence of God, according to Maimonides, where when it comes to the essence of God, we're not entirely sure, right? It's kind of mystery.
Well,
but
can I just try to answer that real quick? I mean, the actions are caused by God. So in a way, they are indirectly speaking about the essence itself, indirectly, as you say. Okay.
Right.
So they're God's actions. So in a sense, you could say, well, then I guess he really is compassionate, but he's certainly not compassionate in the same way, in exactly the same way that a human being, suffers compassion or suffers pain.
Right. So I think
Sorry for interrupting.
Oh, sure, no problem. I was just going to say what Swami was saying, I think in a way can be accepted by Islamic philosophers who kind of grapple with the distinction between the personal and the impersonal, right? Given a certain metaphysic, I think you can make it work in Islam.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to move on to a series of short questions, and I want to begin with the relationship between God and time, which is a favorite closer to truth topic, as I said, even if you don't believe in God and you're not sure about time. So here's the question. I want a very short answer to this, then we'll explore it. Is God inside of time and everlasting? That's choice one. Choice two is God is outside of time and timeless. So let's start with Imran. We're talking to you. So in Islam.
Yeah. Sure. So just very brief. It seems to me that the dominant view is that God is outside of time, because of the model of creation ex nihilo that I think is embraced by most Islamic thinkers. So
okay, I want a short answer. Okay. Ryan, for Christianity?
Christians are split over this issue. So they're going to say some timeless, some are going to say temporal. And then there's a smaller section of Christians that are going to say that time is an attribute of God. So people like Isaac Newton are going to say that time is actually part of the very essence of God.
Okay, Swami, for your tradition of Hinduism.
Yeah, I would, in our tradition, we accept a strong form of panentheism. So we would say yes to both. I mean, we would say that in its impersonal aspect, God is beyond time. So as pure consciousness, but God has also become, there's nothing but God. So this entire universe is God, which means God is time and God is within time also in his immanent aspect.
Josh, for Judaism?
Well, that's a good question. I would say, to try to answer it quickly, we say that, God is the creator of everything. God is the creator of a world which is temporal. So in some sense, God, the essence, the infinite essence of God is beyond time, is timeless. But there has to be some way for that infinite essence to manifest itself in the world, to engage in actions that occur at certain times and certain places, right? It's not just a question about time; it's also a question about space, right? We don't, we want to say that God is, is not a physical being. God is beyond time. At the same time, God is able to somehow cause a world to exist or cause physical actions to take place at specific times. Time is very important in Judaism. We have the Sabbath. Sabbath is the holy day. That's just one, little example of how somehow, God is involved with time just as much as God is involved with the physical world, even though he himself is not physical or subject to, temporal decay, if you will.
Yeah, but yeah, have your cake and eat it at the same time. I like that. Ryan, you have a book in progress, From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker, in which you describe two options for God being, in some sense, responsible for the existence and nature of time. Could you just describe it briefly, very briefly, and then I'd like each of the others to respond to it.
Yeah, so I identify two views. One is called the Creationist View, which says that God creates time. Then they have to kind of spell out what they think time is. And then the Identification View, which says that time is identified with God in some sense. And they also have to spell out a different theory of what they think time is. Those are the two views.
Okay, so I'd like each of you to respond to that very quickly. Swami.
Yeah, Hindu philosophers in general, they use the term srishti in Sanskrit, which is not exactly creation, but projection might be better. And in the Upanishads, they use this analogy of a spider when it ejects a web out of its own body. So it's that kind of idea. So in that sense, you can say that God projects time in its personal aspect.
Okay, Josh.
It sounded like Ryan articulated two different possible views, correct? Yeah, I guess from a Jewish point of view, I might be wondering, what's really at stake, if you will, in who's right about this question. Like, take your pick, whichever view you find better. I guess I don't see, when people start, this does not seem to me like an issue that there has to be some correct answer to. I guess it's correct.
Honestly, I think there does have to be a correct answer to it.
Okay.
We may never know it. We may never know it, and we may never even have the capacity to know it. We might not even understand it if we did know it.
I take your correction. I misspoke. I didn't mean that there isn't a true answer. I'm not sure what difference it makes. There's a true answer about, whether there's, I have 10 hairs or 50 hairs, but I'm not sure it matters to anybody. That's what I meant. I'm not sure which answer matters.
I can honestly tell you it matters to me, because I want to try to understand what God is like if I'm going to worship God. And this is not just some, academic exercise, but we really love this stuff. All of us on this panel, we love this stuff. And to me, it's really worth exploring. So Ryan, I look forward to your book, and we should have more conversations about it. I want to go on to the next question, and this is again a short answer to begin, and then we can explore it. So, do in all of your traditions, though you describe God with a lot of similarity, a lot of differences, and some very clear differences that we've seen, in your tradition, do you believe that all the others are worshiping the same being? Is it the same supreme being or not? It's nice to be nice, but it's nicer to be true. So Swami, in your book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, you defend religious pluralism. You quote Sri Ramakrishna as God is infinite and the paths to God are infinite. So how do you deal with clear contradictions among religions?
Yeah, so that's in philosophy of religion, that's called the problem of conflicting religious truth claims. And I think John Hick, I think he helps move the conversation forward by distinguishing kinds of truth claim. And I'll just briefly mention. So on the one hand, he has historical and transhistorical truth claims. So, did Christ die on the cross or not? That's a historical truth claim. That's if we can go back in time, we could theoretically adjudicate the question. Then there are what he calls metaphysical truth claims, which are also conflicting, right? I mean, is it possible for God to incarnate as a human being? And from the standpoint of my tradition, the claim is that the truth claims about the ultimate reality, about metaphysical questions, are actually complementary rather than conflicting, and that the truth claims about historical and transhistorical matters aren't soteriologically vital. They're not the essential things. And then the question is, well, how can truth claims about the ultimate reality be complementary rather than conflicting? And Sri Ramakrishna gives a famous example of a giant elephant and 5 different people who are blind are touching different parts of the elephant. One person saying, well, I think it's the elephant's furry. Another one saying, no, I think it's scaly. And there's one person who can see, he's sighted. And so he says, no, you're all right, but you're all wrong in the sense that, right? So each of you is actually making contact, accessing, knowing a particular aspect of one and the same reality. So the person who can see the entire elephant corresponds to the person who has realized multiple aspects of God. And so Sri Ramakrishna himself claimed to have realized God as Allah, but also as Christ, and also as Krishna, and also as the non-dual pure consciousness. So on that epistemic basis, he's making that kind of claim about religious pluralism.
Very, very quickly, you distinguish between your view and perhaps Sri Ramakrishna's view and John Hick's view, as John Hick's view has changed. And we've interviewed John Hick, a wonderful interview a few months before he died, actually. People can see that on the Closer to Truth website, closertotruth.com. So what is your critique of Hick's religious pluralism?
Yeah, I mean, so the main thing is, and we go into kind of Hick exegesis very quickly, but the main issue is he claims that the ultimate reality is the real an sich. So he uses this Kantian terminology, which implies that there's something noumenal about it. And then he says that all the different gods of the different world religions are phenomenal. And to me, ontologically, that seems to downgrade the reality of the deities of the different world religions. So there doesn't seem to be an ontological continuity between the real an sich and the various manifestations of gods. Whereas in our tradition, there's a very strong ontological continuity, because I think it's like what Josh was saying about Judaism, but that it is the same God that actually manifests as all the different deities of the different world religions.
Christianity, Ryan, seems to be an exclusivist religion where Jesus being the only way, no one comes to the Father except through me. Can you deny such exclusivism to Christianity?
You could say that, of course, everybody is going to come through Christ, but they just might not in this life, or they might not realize it. So within Catholicism, they'll talk about this anonymous Christianity view. The idea would be something like this. All of us are worshiping the absolutely perfect being who is the foundation of reality. We have different conceptions and different ways of like how we unpack that, how we understand that, but we're all aiming at that. That's all what we all worship. So yeah, you see people like C.S. Lewis as well in saying these kind of things of like, yeah, we're all worshiping the same God. It's because of Christ that we're able to maybe have salvation, but maybe we're just not aware of Christ in this moment, or maybe we're just, yeah.
That's not a small point.
No, it's not.
I believe that. So let's not throw that one away. I mean, say, oh, by the way, you have to.
By the way, you got Jesus at some point, but yeah, right, yeah. It's just a tiny little issue. Yeah.
Okay, Swami, from Ramakrishna's standpoint, I think you say that it's the case that the Christian dogma, speaking directly to Ryan here, that Christ is the sole incarnation of God, you call another form of conceptual idolatry, since it limits the infinite God to a single human manifestation. Defend that, and we'll see what Ryan says.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we take seriously God's omnipotence, let's say, especially, God, it seems to me, logically should have the power to manifest not just once, but multiple times. So if he can incarnate once as Christ, why can't he incarnate before Christ and also after Christ? I mean, that would be the logical argument, I think.
Oh, yeah. A lot of
What's your-
people are happy to say that that's logically possible. What you get at what's called the Fifth Ecumenical Council, they try to give these reasons for saying that it has to be an utterly unique event. And they'll try to build in some sort of like salvation reasons or something. But everybody in the Christian tradition, as far as I'm aware, says, of course, it's possible for God to do multiple incarnations. There's nothing
Yes,
logically
I guess
contradictory
the
about
Hindu
that.
would just say, the more the merrier, right? So the idea is
Yeah.
that the more incarnations, the more opportunities for salvation for a vast array of people, right?
Yeah, there were actually a lot of people in some of the early days of the church where they did say that, but it got condemned as a heresy. The details of which I won't bore you with at the moment, but yeah, there were people in the Christian tradition who said exactly that. They're like, yeah, that sounds great, but then they got condemned as heretics. So
Our ground rules, by the way, our ground rules are for this panel and for all closer to truth, there are no heresies. In fact, heresies are wonderful probes of how people think. So you bring up a heresy, you know, you'll get a big smile from me. The idea of multiple incarnations that Swami is representing, that Ryan has given a nuanced understanding, is actually a part of a new area called astrotheology within Christian philosophy, to ask, you know, assuming there are other sentient beings in the world, there's a whole other subject that Closer to Truth explores. But if there are, you know, they cannot be excluded from the salvic processes. So did Christ once and for all dying here satisfy all of them, or does each world need their own? We're not going to address that, but the question is very probative. Imran, in Islam, Islam acknowledges both Judaism and Christianity as precursors, but affirms Islam as the final revelation. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Right.
So, how does that affect this fundamental question of what is the way to salvation, and are there different approaches that are equally valid to Islam?
So, difficult question, Robert. It's an important one. I think it depends on which Muslim group you talk to. There are inclusivist interpretations of Islam. You know, as you point out, in the Quran, we read explicitly that, you know, the Jews, the Christians, whoever truly believes in Allah and the last day and does good, will achieve salvation. We read this. But, you know, to be completely fair, there are other verses that suggest that, you know, if you, we'll take Christians as an example, if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, then you're going to get into trouble, right? So it depends on how you deal with that tension within the Quranic text. You know, some people have argued that certain verses have abrogated other verses. This becomes like an exegetical point, a debate and controversy. It's controversial. There are, though, some Islamic scholars who have really pushed for a kind of inclusivism where salvation is open to people from other faiths. How does one person put it? You know, they made the same point within a Christian context. You might be saved, you know, in your faith, even if you're not saved through it, if that makes sense. So there are Muslims who will say, yes, you know, there are Jews, there are Christians, there are others who will obtain salvation, even if it's not through their doctrine and practice.
Joshua, Judaism does not proselytize. They accept new members, but they don't proselytize, and does not claim exclusivity, right? To believe that that God has a relationship with the Jewish people, and they maybe have special rules, but God has a much broader reach. The Noahide laws that say that non-Jews don't have to obey some of the Jewish technical laws, but have their own kind of broader understanding. Is that right?
Yes, I think, you know, it just occurred to me, what you say is correct. I think that maybe there's another side to this question, which is we can talk about what is required for a salvation, and we can also talk about what is the best possible way of living your life here on this world. I mean, salvation might occur, you know, to someone who lives not such a great life, maybe morally, spiritually, they're a failure, but somehow in the end, they get salvation, they go to the next world or end up with God in the next world or something like that. So I think, you know, Judaism certainly says, Maimonides actually writes this in his Code of the Law, that the pious, the righteous Gentile will, you know, inherit the next world. However, I think Judaism does teach, in my understanding, and there may be other ways of articulating Judaism than what I would say, or what I think is correct, is that from a Jewish point of view, certainly for the Jewish people, this is the best way, all right? For the people of Israel, this is the Torah, following the Torah, and obeying the commandments. This is a very, I should have mentioned this earlier when we're talking about traits of God. God's personhood is so important, partly because it's linked to the notion of God as a commander. So there are commandments that are obligatory upon the Jewish people, and for us to achieve, this is the Jewish teaching. Of course, Judaism accepts converts, it doesn't proselytize, but anyone can join. That the role of the people of Israel is critical in bringing about the ultimate redemption of this world, bringing world peace and universal justice to this world is part of the task of the Jewish people. And I believe classically Judaism teaches that there are other prophets, there are non-Jewish prophets, there's other ways of doing things, other ways of relating to God. But Judaism does teach that it's through the Torah, which I think Christians replace somehow with a relationship with Christ. And I know that's a somewhat controversial issue too, but at least classically, Christianity, from our point of view, is mistaken at least in its historical claim of somehow trying to replace the Torah with a relationship through Christ with God. So we think that that's wrong. But to go back to your original question, in some sense, I think it's true. There's a lot of commonality to who the God is that we are all worshiping.
Josh, not to interject my own personal opinion, but if the role of the Jewish people is to bring peace to the world, we're not doing such a good job. Anyway, I just want to ask one final question.
I disagree with that.
Yeah, you think we're doing a good job?
Yeah, but I don't think that's the purpose of this discussion.
Okay. Let me ask this final question, then we'll go to the questions from the audience. In your tradition, how important to understand is the ineffable, the apophatic, rather than the cataphatic, the negative understanding? Let's proceed chronologically. Just give me a very short answer in Hinduism.
Yeah, so depends on the tradition. So Advaita Vedanta, for instance, because they say that the ultimate reality is nirguna, it's without attributes, it's strictly apophatic. But the theistic traditions take God to be personal, and so it's more cataphatic. But I think that most theistic Hindus would endorse Aquinas' idea of analogical predication. So we can attribute qualities and attributes to God, but that it can't be literally true. There's some divine sense in which they're true.
Yeah. Judaism, Josh?
Can you rephrase the question?
Yeah, how important is the apophatic tradition in approaching God in Judaism? It seems less than in other traditions that there's more belief that you can understand aspects of God.
Well, I mean, I think, to go back to my favorite philosopher in Judaism, Maimonides, it's both. There's the essence of God, like we said before, the essence, the infinite essence that's indescribable, ineffable. That's where a lot of the apophatic tradition might be relevant. And you do also find it in the mystical tradition, in the Jewish Kabbalah. There is a notion of God as Ein Sof, as the infinite essence. And however, by the same token, we can also have a relationship with God through doing good deeds and through praying to God and meditating on the world and appreciating the manifestation of God in the world as part of the spiritual path. So I think it's there, it's important, but like you say, there's a non-apophatic aspect to our relationship with God as well.
Ryan, Christianity?
It's prominent in the Christian tradition, but I don't think it should be, because to be ineffable is to be unspeakable or unknowable. And the Apostle Paul's made it very clear that Christians do not worship the unknown God like the pagans do. Instead, Christians worship a God who's made himself known through creation, through prophets, and then ultimately through Jesus Christ.
Islam, Imran.
So just very quickly then, Robert, I think between like the two extremes, you do have an option, which is just to say mystery, right? And I point this out because it seems to me that when it comes to the two main denominations in Islam, Sunni Islam, Shiite Islam. In Sunni Islam, I think there's a strong tradition of appealing to mystery where you accept the traits of God in scripture, in say the Quran, without really inquiring into the modality question. You know, what exactly does this mean? How is God's knowledge like our knowledge? Whereas I find that in Shiite theology, there are people who lean in the apophatic direction.
Okay, some questions from the audience. We have a few minutes left. The first question is from Dan, that many of the panelists support the ineffability of God, what we're talking about, from diverse perspectives. Does this underpin religious pluralism, because it suggests that if there is an ineffable God that is described differently from different perspectives, that this ineffability kind of unifies them? Ryan, how would you respond to that?
It does seem to me that ineffability plays a large role in religious pluralism, because I mean, John Hick, who was mentioned earlier, I mean, that's a very key part of his argument for religious pluralism.
Okay, next question here is from Andre. It's addressed to Swami. Is substance monism the view that there is only one substance, nothing else, an ontological commitment of your view of the divine?
Monism is, I'm not sure that we can think of God as a substance, but the idea that there's only God exists, that's fundamental to our tradition, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So as each of you, let me see, I have another question here that I see, but it is not loading properly, so I can't see these other questions quite yet. So let me ask each one of you, if you had to ask a challenging question of your colleagues, what would that be? Imran, if you challenge any one of your colleagues here, what would you ask?
It's a question that I think I ask myself, that I struggle with in my own tradition, which is how to view the others, or how to view people who are not part of your tradition. Particularly, I will say, Robert, here, if you're in the Abrahamic traditions, so if you're Christian or Jew or Muslim, when we look at both some of our doctrines that seem to be quite kind of exclusivist and harsh when it comes to people who belong to other communities, and when we look at our own history, right? How do you deal with that? Yeah.
Swami, what questions would you ask your Abrahamic colleagues?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, especially with regard to the question about other religions, which Ron just mentioned, I get the sense that Abrahamic religions, at best, they approach a kind of inclusivism, the idea of anonymous Christians or anonymous Jews or anonymous Muslims, but that they're not able to make the quantum leap into pluralism, except for some exceptions like, let's face it, unorthodox Christians like John Hick or Paul Knitter, Raimundo Paniker, right? But I mean, you know, do you see the next generation, or at some point in the future, that some of these Abrahamic religions can evolve to the point of a really robust pluralism?
Okay, my email is working better now. So question 3 from John, addressed to Swami. Swami, you're very popular today with the audience. The quote is that you say that God is time and is space. And does this suggest that the spatio-temporal universe is infinitely old and infinitely large, which may seem to contradict modern cosmology?
Oh, okay. I mean, it's a big question, but so in Hinduism, there's only this is the universe in its manifest state, but that eventually, after a long time, it'll kind of contract into a kind of seed form, but it's still there. So in a certain sense, this world is infinite or eternal, but it's not always in this form. Yeah, I guess that's a short answer.
Okay, good. We like short. Question 4 from David. To all panelists, Robert talked about the problem of anthropomorphizing God's attributes. And the question is, how can we describe God without committing to it? In other words, I assume the question means that how can you not anthropomorphize God, because that's the only way we have of thinking about things. So is this a vicious cycle, and are we just fooling ourselves? Start with Josh.
I don't think so. Again, I may sound like I'm harping on the same point endlessly, but there's the essence of God and there's God's actions, right? There's the ultimate essence of God is infinite and indescribable and is not in any way like a human being. However,
Okay. Ryan?
I think we're stuck with anthropomorphic descriptions of God, and it doesn't bother me.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place we can end. It doesn't bother me. I've had a great time. I've made 4 new friends, and we look forward to seeing you again on Closer to Truth in different forms. Thank you, Yujin Nagasawa of the University of Birmingham, for this marvelous project, the Global Philosophy of Religion project. It's much needed in today's world, and we look forward to its great success in the future. Thank you for everyone in the audience for joining us, and there's much more to come.